you don't have this problem of essentially designing, as David Hume put it, a constitution for knaves who have no interest but their own. In fact, we should think about policy, including schooling, as we've got a heterogeneous population. Human beings are incredibly, we're incredibly versatile in the kinds of motives we bring to bear, all of us sometimes acting selfishly. And I'm sure all of us sometimes acting generously. So it's slightly, we're not trying to mobilize selfish people to act like they were generous. We're trying to mobilize a whole population of mixed people to act in such a way that generosity wins out some of the time when it's necessary. So that's, I mean, I think that those are very important things, and we're just beginning to figure out how you would actually organize things differently if you really believed that not everyone is selfish. Now notice, I'm not saying everybody's altruistic. I'm saying we've got a heterogeneous population, and we each can switch also. Sometimes applying incentives that are designed for selfish people to people who are not really selfish means that they'll act selfishly. I mean, we have overwhelming evidence of that. Okay, now I wanted to know the implications of the results for development, particularly given that it's heavily influenced by the World Bank and the IMF. I think the kinds of implications about that are pretty clear. And the implication is that if you think the process of development is a process by which people should become free, equally free, and have flourishing lives like Amartya Sen does, then it's not the school system which is the problem, really. It's the model of development in which you're proposing an economy in which very few people will have the decision-making power, which could even require the cognitive skills of a fully developed human being. And you'll have a hierarchical structure which will work better if some people have been inured to sitting in their seats and just paying, and just obeying orders. And that's not a fully developed human being. So, I mean, our whole direction has been towards saying there's a problem with the model of development, and we shouldn't blame schooling because of what Verity said. Obviously, schools are in a bind. They either produce deviants or they produce people who are going to fit into the order, which is in a certain sense inconsistent with the highest ideals of educators, namely a flourishing pattern of human development plus equal opportunity. Now, I mean, as I say, when I said at the beginning, that's the main point of our book, of the old book. That was the main point of the book, and also it's a big weakness because obviously a book on schools is going to be read by teachers mostly and students, and everybody wants to know, okay, what do we do about it? And well, I'll tell you what I did about it. I spent my life basically trying to change the economic system, and I haven't spent a whole lot of my life trying to change the school system, and because I believe that's the root of the problem. Now that won't fit everybody because most, you got a job and you're working in your classroom and you're trying to get some guidance of what I should do. I've thought about this a lot, obviously, because even before the book came out, teachers would criticize our work for saying, hey, nothing here for me. And I said, no, that's not true. You're a citizen. There's plenty here for you, but maybe there's nothing here for in your classroom. And I thought after, well, maybe there is a little something there, modest and inadequate though it is. And that's that, suppose you think that you're failing, or you're in this kind of bind that Verity mentioned. It really helps to know why you're in that bind, that you're not failing. That is, you're actually in a very bad situation because you know that the kids would like to be creative and independent, but they'd also want to get a job, and their parents feel the same way. Just understanding that bind is very helpful towards not blaming yourself, towards not thinking of yourself as being the failure as a teacher, just a teacher who's dealing with a very, very difficult contradiction of in the roles. So, Rebecca, I don't really have an alternative model of schools. And now the reason, I read a lot and I talk to a lot of people and I love education. So the reason why I don't, quote, have one is because I'm certainly not an expert on it. And I do know a fair amount about the stuff I do write about. I try to write about the things I know about. So I'm just not going to say what I think about the roles of schooling. But obviously, developing the capacities to understand the world as it works in a broad sense, critical capacities, is very important, because otherwise you're not going to have people joining social movements and political movements to try to change the economy. But that's not, and interestingly, notice that focuses on the cognitive skills. Yeah, there's a lot of obvious other things having to do with solidarity with people, and also the cultivation of these altruistic norms. Well, why don't I ask for some more questions or comments? Is that right, you think now? I mean, I didn't really answer your question, but as you know. No, by the way, some of them I couldn't answer. Like, I don't really know the answer to your question. I'm convinced that, I mean, that in our book, having documented, we think, that what we were saying is true, we obviously did ask, how did it get that way? And so we have 3 historical chapters in our book, which interestingly don't come at the beginning, as you'd think they might. They come towards the end of the book, because first we document what the present is, and then we do history backwards. We say, gee, how'd that happen? And then we study the common school movement in Massachusetts, and the development of the high school, and the development of higher education in 3 separate chapters. And we try to provide an explanation for how various social conflicts and so on worked out, that the schools implemented this kind of correspondence principle most of the time, except for higher education in the 60s and 70s being a big exception, because it really wasn't doing its job, the job of socializing people for the roles they could expect. Okay, I think enough. So let me, you had a question.
Yeah, my name is Jacob, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, there was a brief section in one of the papers that we read that talked about the stigma of GEDs and vocational education.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and how employers view that as a negative or a positive, and how that affects the overall system in terms of school and the economy.
This work on the GED is the work done by James Heckman, the econometrician I mentioned. He's got a book which is, I don't know if it's out, it's coming out, it's called Hard Evidence on Soft Skills. And it's an outstanding body of work. It collects work done over a decade. The bottom line is this. You all know what the GED is. And the GED is what you would think would be a plus in the labor market, but it's not. Now, what's wrong with getting a GED? Okay, so I'm an employer, and you come to me, and you say, did you graduate from high school? And you say, no. And but I got a GED. Uh-oh, right? Because if I thought that Jacob was just stupid and he couldn't get through high school, that's why he dropped out. Hey, no problem. I'm not looking for a genius. I just want somebody to turn a crank or to deliver papers or something, right? So that's what I'm looking for. But if I find out that you had the intellectual skill to get through high school, but you didn't do it anyway, you're going to be a problem. So the signal of the GED is you had what it takes to graduate from high school, but you couldn't hack it. And this, I can't think of better evidence for what Gintis and I said, 30 years ago. And of course, coming from the far right of the political spectrum, that's good too, because it means we're not just grinding an axe here. People who really study what people are looking for are saying, yes, it's a problem if you reveal that you were smart enough to get out to graduate. That's Heckman's interpretation. I think he's right. It's very dismal. We all know people who struggled hard to pass the GED. And you hope that it only works on the average, but not all the time, because you'd like your nephew to actually make it. Yeah.
Yes. Since you wrote the book, there's been so much written about the shift of the economy from the industrial manufacturing to the information age, that whole thing. And surely that changes the argument somewhat. But is it that schools, since they haven't changed structure or function hardly at all since you left, on the whole, is it that they lag?
Maybe the task that they...
Is there something else going on?
People believe that the intellectual demands of the modern economy are considerably greater than the past. The evidence for that is astoundingly weak. If you look at it, we did in a paper which we published in the Journal of Economic Literature. It's cited in one of the papers. Essentially, I'm struck by the same thing. And it may be that the task of the schools is what we said it was, and that hasn't changed. I mean, I've always had the impression that America, in fact, many economies, have a surplus of intellectual talent in their labor forces. That is, we basically have, I mean, we don't have I mean, our problem is not dumb workers. We have dumb jobs. Our workers are almost always a lot smarter than their jobs. I mean, if you wonder that, just sit down with somebody who's doing a job that you might once have called unskilled. I hope you never do that again. You might once have called that person unskilled, and just have a long conversation with that individual and find out what he or she is actually thinking about and knows about, what they've read lately, and so on. I've had the great pleasure of doing that because I teach crash courses in economics to trade union members. And, you know, I have to say, I think I was a little snobby when I started out. I didn't think they were intellectuals. I didn't think they read the same kind of stuff that I read. And wow, you find out that people who are turning a crank somewhere, you know, well, sure enough, they're very, very smart people. So I think what we've got is not underqualified workers, but underqualified jobs. And so, in general, it could be that the intellectual demands are moving up, but, you know, if you know enough economics to know that if the demand for skills is increasing, but you still have a surplus, it's not going to make any difference. The price isn't going to go up. So that could be what's happening. And the schools may be recognizing that. They may know, look, willy-nilly, we're producing a lot of smart people. We're not producing people who can fit in and who can, you know, play the game. But I think there's also another good side to this. I mean, there is a good side to it, and I think it's been going on. And this is not something that we wrote in the book. I recently studied the inheritance of wealth, and I started, believe it or not, with hunters and gatherers, and I went up to agriculturalists and pastoralists, and I've done a lot of stuff on modern wealth. And I came to the conclusion, well, among hunters and gatherers, wealth is not inherited much, because wealth is your body. And somatic skills, so-called, human capital in the body, your strength and your height and so on, is relatively non-heritable. I mean, it is genetically inherited, but because of recombination, because of spousal genes being uncorrelated with, substantially uncorrelated, the correlation between, say, whether the dad's a good hunter and the son's a good hunter is extraordinarily low, very, very low. I'm not saying that, I found that out in a study. If you go up to land and cows, the correlation between the dad's cows and the son's cows is huge, and the same with land. So now we enter into a period, and by the way, I think it's easier to pass on your cows than it is to pass on your education. I mean, the point of my book with Gintis was education is very passed on. It's a lot closer to cows than John Dewey or any of the early exponents of equality in education or fairness in education would have imagined. But it really is harder to get your son to be a big success in, say, higher education than it is just to pass on the cows to him, or the land. So I think beginning as early as maybe 200 years ago, when education became relatively more important, we began to have opportunities for a more egalitarian society simply because it was harder and harder for the rich to make sure that their children had all the chances. Now, the school system could do a much better job of that by driving down the correlation between dad's education and son's education, mom's education, daughter's education, and so on. That's, you know, that correlation could be driven a lot lower, and it is much, much lower in many countries. It isn't changing over time, by the way. It's not going down.